Hello, it's Roger, author of the Azure Sandbox, and today we're going to use the Azure Sandbox to demonstrate some real-world capabilities that a customer of mine needs to do some processing of some image files up in Azure. So the scenario that the customer has is they have this scanner device in their lab environment. And this scanner is a lab instrument that scans slides. And when it produces a slide, it creates a big image file, and it copies those image files using SMB over to a file share that's connected to a lab workstation with 8 terabytes of storage. So what they want to do is they want to pick these image files off of the lab workstation, and they want to move them up to Azure for processing, but they don't want to copy them over their private network because they don't want to soak their network bandwidth for their private network. So they'd rather just send these image files up to Azure in a secure way over an internet-facing endpoint using HTTPS. So we're going to show how we can use the Azure Sandbox to demonstrate this capability by sending an image file using HTTPS from an environment outside of Azure, which is my workstation, to a secure internet-facing endpoint connected up to an Azure Files share, right? So we're going to move one of these files over into this Azure Files share, and we're going to show how a virtual machine up in Azure can process that. So we'll call this a VM process. And it can process that file using SMB up in Azure. So we're going from SMB to HTTPS over the internet to an Azure file share, back to SMB to process the image up in Azure. Okay, so the specific parts of the Azure Sandbox that we're going to use are this storage account, which has an Azure Files share associated with it. And we're going to use our Windows jump box here, JumpWin1, to simulate the server that processes the image files up in Azure, right? And then we're going to use Azure Storage Explorer on our client to set up the secure access to the storage account over HTTPS. So let's get into the demo and see how this is going to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at this storage account up in Azure. So in my Azure environment, here's my storage account that's part of my sandbox. And if you remember, my sandbox includes an individual file share that we call my file share. And we can attach to that using SMB inside an Azure virtual network through a private endpoint that we have provisioned for that file share. So everything in Azure stays on private IP addresses on that private endpoint. So how can we open up this file share for secure HTTPS uploads? That is the question. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at my firewall for my storage account. And what you can see that I've done here is I've enabled internet access to my storage account for selected virtual networks and IP addresses. So the specific IP address that I've added is the IP address associated with my workstation, which is the machine that I'm running on now on my home network. Okay, and then the only other thing that's connecting up to that storage account is that private endpoint that's provisioned as part of the Azure Sandbox. So that's how machines inside of Azure can map drives and stuff to this file share. Okay. So that's the first thing that I set up, was to enable that specific Azure firewall setting to let this specific IP address in over the public network. Okay. So because I have that set up, I'm going to run a nice utility called Azure Storage Explorer. And what Azure Storage Explorer is kind of a rich client interface to Azure storage. And it's useful for doing all kinds of things, including generating shared access signatures for secure access into Azure Storage. So I'm going to launch Storage Explorer here, and when it comes up, we'll get connected, and we should be able to get a connection because I'm connecting from my workstation, which I've allowed through the Azure Firewall. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to sign into Azure. And I'll authenticate. And now Storage Explorer should be signed in. Okay, and I am. So Storage Explorer shows, yep, I'm logged in to Azure using this particular subscription. So now when I open up Storage Explorer, I should be able to see all the storage related stuff in that subscription. And so if I expand this tree, it'll go out and find all the storage resources. And here's my storage account. That's that same storage account we just looked at in the Azure portal. But this time I'm accessing it from Azure Storage Explorer on my workstation outside of Azure. So if I expand this, we should be able to see kind of what's in that storage account. And specifically, if I expand these file shares, I should be able to see the file share. So I can see the file share now from my workstation, at least from an administrative perspective, to do stuff with it. So let's go connect to this same file share from up in Azure using the Sandbox. So to do that, I'm going to go into my Windows jump box, which is JumpWin1, and we'll connect up using Azure Bastion. Grab my password from Key Vault. And now we have a connection to my Jumpbox server inside of the Azure Sandbox, running up in Azure. Okay, so 2 environments now connected. I've got my workstation on my home network connected. I've got my virtual machine running up in Azure connected, and that virtual machine up in Azure is going to be the thing that simulates the machine that processes the images that come in. Now, if you remember from my diagram, I needed to connect to the file share using SMB up in Azure, right? I need SMB here, right? So let's go ahead and connect up to that file share using SMB up in Azure. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go get the fully qualified domain name of my Azure Files share. And the way I get that fully qualified domain name is just to look at the different endpoints for my different Azure storage services. And here's the endpoint for the file service. So I'll go ahead and copy that because that has the whole fully qualified domain name for the host for where my file share exists. And all I have to do to connect to it is, map a network drive. So we'll use the netuse command for that. So I'll say netuse z colon. I'll paste in that fully qualified domain name. Now we're using, we're not using HTTP here, we're using SMB. So I'm going to have to change this to a double backslash. So the server name is actually the endpoint for my Azure Files share. And then I use my file share as the name of the file share. And I've got this file share domain joined, so I can use my same credentials to map this drive. So there's my file share. I've mapped it. If I go out here and I look at it in File Explorer, we should see now we have this Z drive mapped to my Azure File share. So that Azure File share, think of it as a serverless file share hosted in Azure storage. So I can go do stuff to this now. I can create a test folder, and I can go into this folder and I can create files. So everything looks pretty good here. All right, so this simulates the Azure side of the equation. My jump box simulates the server that's going to process the image files, and I've demonstrated here how that server can map a drive over to an Azure File share using SMB, using that netuse command. Okay, now remember, the files are going to come in from the lab, which is outside of Azure, right? So we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to go back to that lab and see how we can set up secure access to that Azure File share. Now, remember I launched Storage Explorer earlier, and I logged into Azure, and here I can see my file share, the same file share that we just mapped a drive to up in that Azure jump box. So there's a lot of different ways that I could provide access to this, but what I really want to do is provide very constrained, limited access that just allows this image file upload process. I don't want to give out more access than I need to, so I don't want to give out, say, the storage account key to do those uploads, because that has, really wide-ranging privileges on the storage account. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Azure Storage Explorer to generate a shared access signature for that file share. So if I right-click on that and I say Get Shared Access Signature, Azure Storage Explorer has a really nice feature to generate these. They're kind of it's nice that there's a GUI to do this, because it's otherwise I'd have to write some code probably to generate this shared access signature. So this basically says that I'm going to sign this key using the storage account key, which is fine. I'm not giving out the key. I'm giving out a token that was signed by the key. Okay. I'm going to set an expiration date. It's about 24 hours. And I'm going to give it read, write, create, and list privileges, but I am not going to give this token delete privileges. Okay. So when I click on create, the SAS token is generated, and Storage Explorer gives me a nice handy URL that I can use now to copy files up to that file share over HTTPS, right? So we're going to use that. So let's go back to our diagram and take stock of where we are. So we've done this bit over here. We've shown how this VM process can map a drive to this Azure Files SMB share. Now what we have to show is how a workstation that's outside of Azure somewhere, like my workstation on my home network, can use HTTPS to copy files up to that same Azure file share. Okay? And we've generated a shared access signature to do that. Notice it's using HTTPS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a command line utility to upload this file called azcopy. And I've got a script here to do this, but we're going to need to change the shared access signature to the one that we just generated. So the script that I do is this AZ copy test. So let's go edit that. And here's my new shared access signature along with the full path and file name. Now notice the script that I wrote copies a single file, right? This test file 1.bin. So where is that? Let's go look at that file. So if I go into users, let's see here. C users, and I go into my user folder, and I go into scripts. I believe I have a scripts directory in there. You can see I have this 250 megabyte file that I generated, just an empty binary file called testfile1.bin. So that's what we're going to try to upload over HTTPS in a secure way using our shared access signature into that same Azure Files share. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm uploading that single file using this AZ copy command, right? And what I have to do now is I need to update this part of the command to use my new shared access signature. And what I need to do here is add that same single file to the path the destination path. So I'll add that here. And then I'll just replace all this stuff with my new shared access signature that includes the path to the file. And one other thing I have to do, because I'm going to run this using a batch file, I've got to escape out these parentheses that are showing up in this access token, because that has a special meaning in batch files. So we'll just do a quick search and replace and escape those out so that the batch file doesn't get confused. All right. So I've gone ahead and I've edited my batch file. I've added the shared access signature that we generated using Azure Storage Explorer. And now I'm going to run that file. I'm going to run that command file. So we'll do a AZ copy test. And it runs here, and it's now uploading the file. So we can see that 250 megabyte file has already been uploaded, right? And there's the total number of bytes that have been transferred. So I've done a secure upload using a shared access signature to a secure internet-facing endpoint into an Azure storage account, and I've landed that file into an Azure Files share that's hosted in that same Azure storage account. So if we go up to Azure now, we should be able to see that file. So if I back out of this test folder I created, boom, there's my new test file that I just uploaded in a secure way using HTTPS over the public internet. So now I can go to my customer and I can suggest that they use the Azure Sandbox to test these capabilities out. So in summary, I've shown you how to use the Azure Files resources in the Azure Sandbox to test secure file uploads to Azure Files over HTTPS over the public internet using shared access signatures. I hope this has been useful to you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Have a great day.